Before you complain about a slow internet connection, consider the daily anxieties of history's toughest sailors. These weren't men afraid of storms or cannon fire. They were men paralyzed by the existential threat of a breakfast egg, a piece of fruit, or an improperly stored loaf of bread. This isn't a history of navigation. It's a journey into a world governed by a level of paranoia so profound, it makes modern conspiracy theories look reasonable. Get ready for the unwritten rulebook of the sea. 1. Imagine this. You've just finished a hearty breakfast of boiled eggs to prepare for a hard day's work on the high seas. But you can't just toss the shells aside. Oh no. You are now spiritually obligated to perform a meticulous ritual of destruction. Sailors were utterly and unshakably convinced that if they left an eggshell even partially intact, a witch would find it, commandeer it as a tiny demonic boat, launch it into the water, and sail out to their ship to curse the entire voyage. To prevent this magical naval invasion powered by breakfast leftovers, every single shell had to be smashed into 1,000 tiny, unusable pieces. This wasn't about being tidy. It was a critical act of naval defense. 2. The number one enemy on any given ship was not a pirate captain, a kraken, or even the plague. It was the common, unassuming banana. Bringing this particular yellow fruit aboard was considered the ultimate act of tempting fate, a maritime sin of the highest order. The theories as to why are a spectacular collection of paranoid madness. Some claim they fermented in the hold and released toxic, suffocating fumes. Others whispered that venomous spiders loved to hide in the bunches. But the most popular belief was the simplest. The banana itself was a vessel of pure, concentrated bad luck that would magically prevent you from catching fish and might cause the ship to sink out of pure, fruity spite. 3. On the long, mind-numbingly dull days in the middle of the ocean, you might be tempted to whistle a cheerful tune just to break the monotony. This would be a catastrophic, potentially fatal mistake. Sailors believed that whistling was a direct and deeply arrogant mockery of the wind itself. It was seen as a personal challenge flung in the face of the sea gods, who were apparently very sensitive and more than happy to respond with overwhelming, ship-splintering force. The act was literally called whistling up a storm. So if a hurricane-force gale suddenly appeared out of nowhere, you could be damn sure every single eye on that vessel would turn to the idiot who was puckering his lips an hour before. 4. This one is an absolute masterpiece of deranged, testosterone-fueled sailor logic. You've seen them on countless ships in movies and museums. The majestic, and often very explicitly topless, woman carved onto the bow. This wasn't just some crude decoration. Sailors genuinely believed the sea was a chaotic, angry, and distinctly male force. The only way to handle its violent temper tantrums was to present it with something that would shock it into submission. The sight of a bare-breasted woman was believed to either shame the raging sea into calming down, or, perhaps more plausibly in their minds, distract it so thoroughly that it would forget it was about to sink you. It's a bizarre meteorological tool powered by equal parts fear and horny ingenuity. 5. Forget losing a man overboard. The real pant-wetting terror was losing a mop overboard. In the deeply paranoid and symbolic world of a sailor, if a mop, a bucket, or any other cleaning tool accidentally fell into the sea, it was considered a catastrophic omen. This wasn't just a clumsy mistake, it was viewed as the sea claiming a down payment on a much larger prize. It was a grim foreshadowing that the ship itself and everyone on it was now marked for death and would soon follow that very mop into a dark, watery grave. That simple, mundane accident was seen as a cosmic invoice for your souls, and the sea was coming to collect its debt. 6. Sailors would occasionally catch sea turtles for a fresh, welcome meal on a long voyage, but this particular food source came with a terrifyingly specific user manual. You must never, under any circumstances, leave the turtle flipped on its back. This single act was thought to be such a profound and unholy insult to the powers of the sea that it would summon what they called a devil's wind. This wasn't just any storm. It was a supernatural, ship-shredding hurricane that would materialize out of a perfectly clear blue sky, purely out of spite. The logic is non-existent, but the fear was potent. The message was clear. Slightly inconveniencing a reptile, was the same as personally slapping Neptune across the face. 7. Sailors had a very specific blacklist of passengers they did not want on their ship, and near the top was this unholy trinity of bad luck: lawyers, priests, and pigs. Lawyers were believed to bring conflict and misfortune simply by their argumentative nature, which could anger the spirits of the sea. Priests were considered terrible luck because their whole job revolved around death and funerals, making them a walking, talking omen of doom. But the pig was on another level of cursed. The animal was considered so unlucky that you weren't even allowed to say the word pig on board, forcing sailors to invent a whole dictionary of ridiculous euphemisms like the curly-tailed fellow or Mr. Dennis, just to talk about pork. 8. Thanks to classic poetry, this is one of the most famous superstitions, and for very good reason. It was the absolute Mount Everest of maritime taboos. Sailors were deeply convinced that the majestic albatross carried the reincarnated souls of their comrades who had been lost at sea. To harm or kill one of these magnificent birds was therefore not just an act of cruelty. It was a profound desecration, a middle finger to every sailor who had ever died. The punishment wasn't just a bit of bad luck. It was a guaranteed, personalized curse of supernatural torment, where you'd be haunted by thirst, starvation, madness, and the burning, accusatory glare of your entire crew as they blamed you for their inevitable demise. 9. Apparently, the ocean is not only a violent, chaotic force, but it's also deeply prejudiced against redheads. Having a ginger on board was considered a powerful, walking, talking omen of terrible luck. To neutralize this curse, you had to follow a strict social protocol. You had to speak to the redhead before they could speak to you. It's an incredibly awkward icebreaker. And if you were just setting out on a voyage and the very first person you met on the way to the docks had red hair, the only logical and safe option was to immediately turn around, go home, and try again tomorrow. Nothing personal, it's just that your specific hair pigmentation was apparently offensive enough to the sea gods to sink a 200-ton vessel. 10. That single gold earring you see on pirates in the movies wasn't just a fashion statement to look dashing. It was actually the most morbid insurance policy imaginable. Sailors wore it so that if they drowned and their bloated corpse washed up on some foreign shore, the gold could be plucked from their earlobe and used to pay for a proper Christian burial. It was a prepaid funeral plan dangling from your head. Some sailors, ever the optimists, also believed the earring had magical healing properties, claiming it could cure bad eyesight or even prevent drowning altogether. Which, if you think about it, makes the burial plan part a little redundant, doesn't it? 11. On a ship, cats were the undisputed kings. They were considered incredibly good luck, not just for their rat-catching skills, but because they were believed to have a magical, almost psychic, connection to the weather. But this belief had a horrifyingly dark side. If the ship was becalmed, stuck in the dead water with no wind for days, some sailors believed the fastest way to summon a gale was to throw the ship's cat overboard. The logic, if you can call it that, was that this cruel act of sacrificing the lucky charm would anger the sea into a furious frenzy, hopefully providing enough wind to get moving again. It's a truly psychotic strategy that takes the cat from beloved mascot to emergency weather bomb in about 30 seconds. 12. For a sailor, Friday was the unluckiest day on the calendar, period. It was the day of major biblical misfortunes like the crucifixion, and starting a multi-year voyage on a Friday was seen as practically begging for disaster. It was like sending a formal engraved invitation to Neptune that said, "Dear sir, please find enclosed our ship. We would be honored if you would smash it to pieces at your earliest convenience." This belief was so deeply ingrained that ship owners and captains would willingly delay their departure, losing money and time, just to avoid setting sail on what they considered to be a fundamentally cursed day. The week had 6 days for sailing, and 1 day for staying put and being terrified. 13. Imagine you are miles from any shore, surrounded by an endless expanse of gray water, and suddenly you hear the faint, unmistakable ringing of church bells. For a sailor, this wasn't a comforting sound. It was a personalized death sentence delivered by phantom mail. This auditory hallucination, likely caused by the harmonic whine of wind in the rigging, was believed to be a supernatural death knell, It was a sign from the great beyond that someone on the crew was about to die. It's a terrifying thought, your own brain conjuring the sound of your imminent demise. It's the ocean's way of saying your subscription to life is about to expire. 14. Your entire perilous, years-long voyage could be completely doomed before you even unpacked your sea chest. It was critically, obsessively important to step onto a ship with your right foot first. Boarding with your left foot was a cosmic fumble, an immediate sign of bad luck that would infect the entire journey. It's the kind of hyper-specific, obsessive-compulsive rule that demonstrates just how deeply paranoia was embedded in a sailor's bones. Can you imagine the pressure? Tripping and accidentally putting your left foot down first would earn you the hateful glare of the entire crew, who would now blame you for every bad meal and storm for the next 3 years. 15. A ship's name wasn't just a label, it was its soul, its identity registered in the great, cosmic bureaucracy of the ocean. To change it was to commit a terrible act of spiritual identity theft, inviting the furious, bureaucratic wrath of Poseidon himself. Renaming a ship was considered so catastrophically unlucky that it was almost never done. If it was absolutely unavoidable, it required a complex and ridiculous denaming ceremony to purge the old name from the ledger of the deep, which I can only imagine is a very large, very wet book. Failing to do this properly was a guarantee that the ship would meet a tragic and frankly well-deserved end for such poor administrative etiquette. 16. This is one of the most famous and profoundly sexist superstitions in maritime history, and the logic is just a beautiful pretzel of nonsense. The sea itself was considered a fickle, emotional, and very jealous female entity. Therefore, bringing a real, living woman onto a ship would supposedly make the sea fly into a jealous rage, resulting in violent storms and disastrous voyages. The only woman allowed to be on board was the naked wooden figurehead, which, as we already know, was there specifically to calm the sea down by showing it some boobs. So, to recap, fake wooden woman good calms the sea. Real breathing woman bad makes the sea angry. It makes absolutely no sense. 17. Alright, now for the one superstition that wasn't cooked up during a rum-fueled fever dream. This one actually had a brain. Sailors knew that if they were in port and suddenly saw the entire rat population fleeing the ship like it was on fire, it was time to pack their own bags and run for the hills. The rats, you see, lived in the deepest, darkest parts of the hull. They were the first to know if a serious, catastrophic leak had started. Rats fleeing a sinking ship became a famous saying because for these sailors, it was the single most reliable and utterly terrifying alarm bell they had. It was nature's little way of saying, "This vessel has failed its safety inspection." 18. Sailors had a profound fear of tempting fate with their words, as if the universe was constantly eavesdropping, just waiting for them to mess up. Certain terms were completely forbidden, and the word drown was at the very top of that list. Saying it aloud was believed to be like casting a magic spell to summon the event into reality. It's the same logic a toddler uses when they cover their eyes and think they're invisible. Instead, they would use a collection of clumsy, awkward euphemisms like "go to Davy Jones's locker" or "be sent to the bottom." It was a constant, exhausting linguistic dance around a terrifying reality, all because they thought a single word could punch a hole in the ship's hull. 19. A shark is scary enough on its own, but for a sailor, a shark that decided to follow the ship for days was a harbinger of pure, unadulterated doom. They believed the shark wasn't just hungry. It possessed a supernatural psychic knowledge. It was patiently waiting for a specific member of the crew to die, either by accident, illness, or falling overboard. The shark knew your time was up before you did. It was a swimming tombstone, a silent, circling promise from the deep that someone's ticket was about to get punched. It wasn't just an animal. It was a grim reaper with fins, patiently waiting for its scheduled appointment. 20. Personal hygiene took a permanent backseat to appeasing the gods of the sea. Sailors genuinely believed that any clippings of their hair and nails were a personal, sacred offering to Neptune. Once you set sail, you had already made your offering, and that was that. To cut your hair or trim your nails during the voyage was seen as a sign of profound disrespect, like giving a god a gift and then trying to add to it later. So, out of religious piety, they just let it all grow. They became long-haired, long-nailed savages not because they were slobs, but because they didn't want to offend a deity who was apparently very particular about his collection of human keratin. 21. You might think a nice bouquet of flowers would brighten up a dreary, damp ship's cabin. You would be dangerously wrong. To a sailor, bringing flowers on board was the equivalent of bringing a custom-made coffin and leaving it in the middle of the deck. Flowers were for funerals. They were woven into wreaths and laid on graves. Having them on the ship was therefore a direct formal invitation to death himself. It was a clear, unambiguous signal to fate that you were ready for a burial at sea. It's a miracle they even allowed vegetables, frankly. Oh, how lovely. You brought a floral arrangement for the funeral we are now definitely going to have. 22. Sailors were incredibly particular about their luggage, and their prejudice was aimed at one color, black. Carrying a black travel bag onto a ship was seen as catastrophically bad luck. Its dark color symbolized death, and it looked far too much like a body bag for anyone's comfort. Bringing one aboard was seen as a grim prediction of a fatal journey, as if you were packing for your own funeral. It's such an oddly specific and arbitrary superstition. A navy blue bag? Fine. A brown one? No problem. But a black duffel bag? Sorry, mate, you and your portable coffin are not welcome on this voyage. 23. Beyond just being elite-level rat assassins, cats were viewed as living, breathing, furry weather instruments. A playful cat meant good weather and fair winds were on the way. A cat that sneezed was a sure sign of incoming rain. And if a cat started frantically licking its fur against the grain, it meant a hailstorm was imminent and you should probably find a helmet. The most prized of all were polydactyl cats, the ones with extra toes, which were believed to give them superior balance in rough seas, making them the high-performance, all-terrain model of ship's cat. Captains would probably consult the cat's mood before checking their charts. 24. During a severe thunderstorm, in the dead of night, sailors would sometimes see a strange, ethereal, glowing plasma dancing around the ship's masts. This phenomenon, which we now know as St. Elmo's fire, was seen as a powerful and deeply personal omen. But instead of screaming in terror that the ship was turning into a giant lightning rod, they took it as a good sign. They believed it was the souls of their dead comrades, or even guardian angels, arriving to throw a protective rave on the rigging and guide them through the storm. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly insane interpretation that turned a moment of maximum danger into one of supernatural hope. 25. In a sailor's world, you don't just get to drink your rum. The entire Atlantic Ocean gets the first sip. Before a sailor could take his first taste of wine or grog, it was a common and mandatory ritual to pour a small amount out onto the deck as an offering. This wasn't a toast, it was a bribe. This was a libation to the gods of the sea, a small booze tax to keep them happy and, more importantly, to keep them from getting thirsty and swallowing your entire ship whole just to wet their whistle. It was considered monumentally rude to drink without first sharing with Neptune. Can you imagine the divine fury of a god who sees you enjoying a drink and not offering him a drop? 26. Of all the bad omens that haunted the seven seas, seeing the Flying Dutchman was the final boss. This wasn't just a warning, it was a death notice. This legendary ghost ship, captained by a madman and doomed to sail the oceans for eternity, was the ultimate sign of impending catastrophe. If sailors spotted its phantom form glowing on the horizon, it was a non-negotiable message from the cosmos that their own ship was about to be lost with all hands. There was no counter-curse, no prayer, no ritual to escape it. Sighting the Dutchman wasn't a sign to be more careful. It was a sign to start writing your last will and testament on a piece of driftwood. 27. This next one wasn't so much a superstition as it was a brilliant, genius-level life hack for surviving institutional brutality. Flogging with a cat-o'-nine tails was a common and hideously brutal punishment on naval ships. To avoid the worst of it, many sailors would get a massive detailed tattoo of the crucifixion of Christ across their entire back. They knew that most captains and boatswains, despite their cruelty, were God-fearing men. They were banking on the fact that the guy swinging the whip would hesitate to repeatedly strike the holy image of his savior. It's the ultimate loophole, turning your back into a divine shield and forcing your boss into a crisis of faith every time you misbehaved. 28. Once the voyage had truly begun, there was no looking back, literally. A sailor who stood at the stern of the ship and watched his home port disappear over the horizon was considered to have a weak heart and, more importantly, to be bringing bad luck onto the ship. It symbolized a longing for land that could displease the sea, which was apparently a very jealous and insecure entity. It was as if the ocean itself would see you being sentimental and think, "Oh, you miss your family, how dare you? For that emotional infidelity, I shall now try to murder you all with a hurricane." The punishment for being homesick was ensuring you would never see home again. 29. Even the ship's baker had to follow a strict set of soul-crushingly important rules. A loaf of bread once baked must always be kept right side up. To leave it flipped over, resting on its rounded top, was considered a terrible omen that could bring catastrophic misfortune or even death to the entire crew. Some believed it was a direct insult to the Holy Trinity, while others simply thought an upside-down loaf of bread was an open, formal invitation for the devil himself to come aboard. Satan is apparently just chilling in the abyss, constantly scanning the world for improperly stored baked goods to use as a portal. 30. This is a perfect example of the pretzel logic that governed sailors' lives. The one thing you should never, ever wish a sailor is good luck. It sounds completely backwards, but wishing them good fortune was believed to be the fastest way to anger the gods of fate and cause the exact opposite to happen. It was like daring the universe to do its absolute worst, and the universe, having a very fragile ego, would always accept that challenge. Instead, you were supposed to say something boring and professional, like fair winds and following seas. You had to be as neutral as possible to trick destiny into leaving you alone. 31. This tradition is so old and so morbidly practical it's almost beautiful. During a ship's construction, a coin, or several coins, would be placed under the step of the main mast before it was raised. This wasn't for luck. This was a prepayment. This was the fee for Charon, the mythical ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx into the underworld. The logic was that if the ship sank and the crew all drowned, their souls would still have pocket money to pay their fare for the final journey. They were literally building a ship while simultaneously planning for the crew's afterlife transportation. That is some bleak, forward-thinking financial planning. 32. If a sailor's hat blew off his head and into the sea, it was a clear sign of a very long and unlucky voyage to come. But the absolute worst thing you could do was try to get it back. Turning the entire ship around to retrieve a single piece of headwear was seen as an even bigger curse. It was a foolish, sentimental delay that would enrage the sea gods and almost certainly lead to a far worse disaster. The hat was gone. It was a sacrifice, whether you liked it or not. You just had to accept your new, hatless, and deeply unlucky future and hope for the best. 33. The social etiquette of bad luck on a ship was incredibly specific and designed for maximum awkwardness. You were never, ever supposed to hand an item like a mop or a bucket directly to another crew member. Instead, you had to place it on the deck for them to pick it up themselves. Why? Because they believed that handing it over directly would also transfer any bad luck you might be carrying at the moment. It was a simple, paranoid transaction to prevent misfortune from spreading like a virus. It must have made group cleaning projects an absolute logistical nightmare of placing and retrieving tools. 34. Eggs were a valuable source of fresh protein on long voyages, but they came with a bizarre and ticking biological time bomb. If, through some fluke of temperature and humidity in the ship's hold, one of the eggs somehow hatched and a live chick emerged while at sea, it was considered a terrible, voyage-ending omen. This single, tiny, fluffy life form was seen as a profound symbol of a cursed journey. It wasn't a miracle of life. It was a sign that the ship and everyone on it were completely and utterly doomed. No one knows why, but apparently, unexpected poultry was a direct insult to the gods. 35. The ship's bell was the heartbeat of the vessel, marking time and the changing of the watch. So, if it rang on its own, with no human hand anywhere near it, it was one of the most terrifying things a sailor could experience. They believed this was a supernatural cosmic text message from the other side, a direct warning that someone on the crew was about to die. According to the legend, the next person to hear the bell ring after its phantom toll would be the one to perish. Can you imagine the sheer psychological terror? You'd spend the rest of your days with your fingers in your ears, humming loudly, hoping you wouldn't be the next to hear that fateful sound. 36. Salt was a precious commodity and was widely considered a source of good luck on a ship. You could sprinkle it around to ward off evil spirits, which seems practical enough. But it came with a bizarre rule of social etiquette that must have made mealtimes an absolute nightmare. You could never, ever pass the salt cellar directly to another person. It had to be placed on the table for them to pick it up themselves. Why? Because to pass it hand to hand was to pass sorrow. You're not just giving them a seasoning, you're giving them your existential dread. Here you go, Bill. Have some of my crippling anxiety with your salted pork. 37. This superstition was short, to the point, and utterly insane. Stirring your tea, grog, or any other beverage with a knife was a recipe for absolute disaster. In the best-case scenario, it was said to invite conflict and arguments among the crew. But the more extreme version of the belief claimed it was a direct challenge to Neptune himself. You were essentially using your cutlery to poke the god of the sea in the eye, daring him to a duel. And Neptune, apparently having nothing better to do, would happily accept your challenge by immediately sinking your ship. All because you were too lazy to find a spoon. 38. Of all the forbidden words at sea, pig was one of the strangest and most aggressively enforced. Sailors considered the animal so catastrophically unlucky that even speaking its name could bring on a storm. To get around this, they had to invent a whole library of silly, ridiculous euphemisms. They would refer to it as the curly-tailed fellow, the long-nosed chap, or, for reasons no one can explain, Mr. Dennis. Imagine trying to take stock of provisions. All right, lads, we've got the rum, the hardtack, and 40 barrels of salted Mr. Dennis. It's a linguistic nightmare created entirely by the fear of offending an farm animal. 39. In a world absolutely saturated with bad omens and death curses, sailors needed a quick and easy way to generate some emergency good luck. The most common method was to simply touch the collar of their shirt. This small, simple gesture was believed to instantly ward off evil and bring a jolt of good fortune. They used it for everything. If you saw the captain looking angry, you'd touch your collar. If you heard a weird creak in the hull, touch your collar. If you thought you saw a dude with flat feet, you'd probably start frantically stroking your collar like it was a lucky cat. After a few years at sea, their collars must have been worn down to a single, greasy thread. 40. This has to be one of the most nonsensical and oddly specific prejudices in all of human history. For some ungodly reason, sailors believed that people with flat feet were terribly, fundamentally unlucky. Meeting a flat-footed person before embarking on a voyage was a bad omen, and having one as a permanent crewmate was even worse. They were to be avoided at all costs. How did they even enforce this? Did they conduct foot inspections during the hiring process? Sorry, Johnson, your sailing skills are impeccable, but your arches have all the structural integrity of a wet noodle. You're a navigational hazard. Get out. 41. Sailors were deeply suspicious of anyone from Finland or Iceland, believing them to be powerful sorcerers with command over the elements. It was said that Icelandic witches could sell a rope with 3 magical knots tied into it. Untying the first knot would release a gentle, favorable breeze. Untying the second would bring a strong, powerful gale. But untying the third knot would unleash an unstoppable, ship-destroying hurricane. It's the world's most dangerous remote control, and who in their right mind would be tempted by that third knot? It's a big, fibrous red button that says, "Press here for instant annihilation." 42. Beyond just avoiding Fridays, sailors had a whole calendar of what they called dismal days, which were considered cursed for starting any kind of voyage. These dates were pulled from biblical tragedies, like the day Cain killed Abel, or the day Sodom and Gomorrah were wiped off the map. Setting sail on one of these days was viewed as naval suicide, a direct and personal insult to both God and fate. Imagine being a 17th century shipowner trying to schedule a departure. It's a logistical nightmare managed entirely by ancient religious anxiety. It's a miracle they ever found a day that wasn't divinely blacklisted. 43. History itself could create its own superstitions. Old sailors would warn young ones never to set sail on the anniversary of the Great Black Squall, a legendary and terrifyingly sudden storm that supposedly struck a fleet in the Caribbean. According to the story, it swallowed 12 ships in a matter of minutes, leaving not a single splinter of wreckage behind. It wasn't a historical weather event, it was a sea monster with a birthday. Sailing on that specific date was seen as tempting the same squall to return for a repeat performance. It's the ocean's version of a horror movie slasher who comes back every year for a sequel. 44. While albatrosses were sacred and seagulls were fine, the heron occupied a class of curse all its own. Killing a heron at sea was considered an act of such profound evil that it would bring about a biblical-level catastrophe. The legend didn't just promise a storm. It said killing a heron would summon a mutiny from the sea itself, followed by starvation and madness. What does that even mean? Do the fish unionize and rise up with tiny harpoons? Does the water just give up and stop being buoyant under your ship? Messing with a heron was the nuclear option of bad luck, a guaranteed way to make sure your story ended badly. So, that's the mental chaos that somehow powered the age of exploration. A world where the bravest men on Earth were governed by cursed fruit and evil furniture. And it makes you wonder, here's a real question for the comments. Are our modern life hacks, biohacking obsessions, and obsessive wellness fads just the 21st century version of smashing eggshells? Name the single dumbest modern belief that people will be laughing at in 300 years. Let the arguments begin. If your brain survived this journey, hit like and subscribe for more historical madness.